The wind had already buried the front door when Caleb Hartwell cut a hole through his own kitchen floor. Snow hammered the house like fists. The windows were white. The stovepipe screamed as gusts tore across the prairie. His wife Anna stood braced against the table, one hand steadying a lantern, the other gripping the shoulder of their youngest boy. The house shuddered again. Somewhere beyond the walls, boards snapped like dry bones. Caleb dropped to his knees and pulled up the heavy oak hatch he had built into the floor months earlier. Warm air rose from the dark opening. Not the heat of a fire, not the sharp smell of smoke, the slow, steady warmth of animals breathing. He lowered himself through the square opening with a lantern in hand. Below him, 8 horses stood in their stalls, calm, chewing hay, steam lifting gently from their backs. The earth walls did not shake. The ceiling did not groan. The storm that was killing livestock across McLean County could not reach them here. Above, the house trembled. Below, the barn held steady. And as the blizzard howled like something alive on the Dakota prairie, the neighbors who once laughed at Caleb's hillside idea were fighting to keep their own barns from tearing apart. How long would their walls last? Spring of 1886 had come late to the prairie south of the Missouri River. Snow lingered in shallow drifts along fence lines when Caleb Hartwell marked out the slope behind his claim. He had chosen that land for one reason. The hill rose gently toward the north, about 20 feet over a long stretch of ground. The top was flat enough for a house. The face of the hill was firm clay mixed with gravel. It would hold shape if cut carefully. He told the other ranchers his plan on a Sunday after church. "I'm not building my barn beside the house," he said. "I'm building it into the hill, under the house." They stared at him as if he had spoken in a foreign tongue. Jacob Miller, who ran the largest herd in the valley, laughed first. "You mean a cellar?" "No, a stable, 8 stalls, hay storage, full height." "You're planning to sleep on top of horses," Jacob said. "That's not ranching, that's foolishness." Caleb did not argue long. He had learned as a boy in western Pennsylvania that some ideas sounded wrong until they worked. His father had kept livestock in a bank barn cut into a slope, animals below, family above. In winter, the floors stayed warm without wasting wood. In summer, the lower level stayed cool even in heat. The earth did not care about opinions. It followed its own rules. He began digging in June. The first week was nothing but shovels and sweat. Dakota summer pressed down heavy and dry. The clay clung to steel. Caleb worked from sunrise until the heat drove him into shade. In the evenings, Anna and the boys hauled dirt away in a small wagon and spread it to level the future house site. By the end of 2 weeks, a long rectangular cut marked the hill, 12 feet wide at the opening. Deepening back into the earth, Jacob rode by often. "You're making a grave," he said once. "If that ceiling drops, you lose your house and your horses together." Caleb leaned on his shovel. "If I build it weak, yes." "And you're an engineer now." "No, I just know weight travels straight down, so I give it many paths." He dug 8 feet high and nearly 40 feet back before he stopped cutting earth. The soil held firm. Where loose gravel appeared, he shaped it and tamped it tight. He left a thick layer of untouched earth at the top that would become the ceiling. Then came timber. He felled cottonwoods along the river and cut them into thick posts. Each post was set upright every 2 feet in a grid across the barn floor. He dug shallow sockets for each base and packed stone tight around them so they would not shift. It looked like a forest growing underground. Old Ben Carney, a builder who had raised half the cabins in the county, came to see the work. "You're overdoing it," Ben said, stepping between the posts. "You could space these wider." "I could," Caleb replied, "but if one rots or 2 split, the rest must carry the load." Ben ran a hand along one beam. "You planning for failure?" "I'm planning so failure won't matter." Across the tops of the posts, Caleb laid heavy beams he had squared by hand. He worked a whip saw with his oldest son until their palms blistered raw. Each beam rested solid from post to post. Then he ran smaller joists across them. Thick planks covered the frame. Over that he laid tarred canvas, then clay, then 18 inches of packed earth. When he and the boys walked across the ceiling above, it did not sag. That was where the house would stand. The barn walls needed care. Bare clay could crumble under moisture. Caleb set vertical boards along the sides and packed stone behind them where gaps appeared. A shallow trench ran around the outer edge, sloping toward a drain pit at the lowest point. If rain seeped in, it would move away from the stalls. He built the entrance facing south. The north wind carried winter's worst. The south face caught sun and stayed clearer of drifts. A ramp sloped gently down into the barn, not steep enough to frighten a horse. Ventilation troubled him most. 8 horses breathing in an enclosed space would create damp air. So he installed 4 tin-lined shafts that ran from the ceiling up through the earth and out beyond the roofline of the future house. 2 would draw fresh air in. 2 would let warm air rise out. No moving parts, just rising heat and falling cool air. By October, the structure was ready. The horses balked at the entrance the first time. They snorted and shifted, ears flicking at the dark. Caleb led the calmest draft horse first. He spoke low. Let the animal step down the ramp slowly. Once inside, the stall smelled of fresh wood and hay, not rot. One by one, the others followed. That evening, Anna walked down with a lantern. "It feels different," she said. Outside, frost had already silvered the grass. Inside, the air was steady and mild. "The earth stays near 50 degrees, Caleb said. "The horses add to it. We won't fight the wind down here. And the smell. I'll clean daily. Air will move." The house went up in November directly over the back 2/3 of the barn ceiling. Modest walls, a small stove. When snow came early in December, Caleb noticed something. The kitchen floor felt warm, not hot, not fire warm, but alive. When the first cold snap hit and temperatures fell below zero, Jacob Miller burned through a stack of wood trying to keep water from freezing in his barn. Caleb burned less than half that. Word spread, though few admitted interest. Then January came. The morning of the 9th broke clear and bitter. By noon, the wind shifted hard out of the north. Snow came fast and sideways. By nightfall, drifts swallowed fence lines. On the second day, Jacob's barn roof sagged under the weight of snow and ice. Boards cracked, horses panicked. Men fought wind to drag animals into any shelter they could find. On the third day, Caleb heard a sound like distant thunder. It was not thunder. It was timber giving way somewhere across the valley. Inside the hill, the temperature held steady. Every 6 hours, Caleb opened the hatch in his floor and climbed down. He checked posts, checked beams, cleared snow from the outside vents when drifts covered them. The horses chewed hay and stamped calmly. On the 4th night, the wind screamed so loud it seemed to tear at the sky itself, but it could not tear at earth. When the storm finally broke, Caleb spent 4 hours digging out the south entrance where snow had piled nearly 12 feet high against the slope. When he pulled the doors open, sunlight spilled down the ramp. 8 horses walked out, steady and strong. Across the prairie, carcasses lay half buried in snow. Jacob came 2 days later. He looked older. "I lost 19, he said quietly. Roof gave way. Cold finished the rest. He stepped inside the hillside barn and stood still for a long moment. "You went down," he said at last. "We all built up." Caleb nodded. "The wind can grab what stands above it. It can't grab what sits in the ground." By spring, Ben Carney was asking for measurements. By summer, 2 more ranches had cut into hillsides, not exact copies, each shaped by land and need. But the idea had taken root. Caleb's barn served him for decades. He widened it once, added more stalls when his sons grew and started their own herds. The posts held. The beams stayed true. Long after new lumber barns rose across North Dakota, people still talked about the winter of 1887 and the man who had dug into a hill when everyone else built toward the sky. Modern builders now call it earth-sheltered design. They measure soil temperature. They calculate load. They speak of thermal mass and passive ventilation. Caleb never used those words. He only knew this. The prairie wind is stronger than pride. And sometimes the safest place for a barn is beneath your own floor. The spring after the blizzard did not feel like victory. It felt like work. Snow melted slow and heavy across the prairie. Dead cattle surfaced where drifts shrank back from fence lines. Men rode with ropes and sleds, dragging carcasses away before the thaw turned everything foul. The wind that had howled all January now carried a different smell. Caleb Hartwell did not ride far that march. He had fences to repair and a hillside entrance to clear properly. The south face of his underground barn had taken the brunt of the drifting. Though the structure held firm, the earth above had settled in places where snowmelt seeped down. He noticed it first in the drainage trench. Water pooled near the back wall after a heavy thaw, not deep, but enough to make him uneasy. He climbed down through the hatch with a lantern and knelt near the lowest corner of the barn. The sand beneath the planked floor felt damp under his fingers. He pulled up 2 boards and saw the problem. The drainage pit had filled with fine clay washed in from the hillside. If he ignored it, water would stay. Damp meant rot. Rot meant failure. He did not boast about surviving the blizzard. He spent 3 days fixing the flaw. With a shovel and iron bar, he deepened the sump pit and lined it with larger stone. He widened the outer trench and packed fresh gravel along its edge. He cut a narrow channel that sloped slightly more than before, not much, just enough that water would choose the right path. His sons worked beside him, quiet and steady. Will it always need fixing? His youngest asked. Yes, Caleb said. Anything that stands between you and winter will. Above them, the prairie turned green again. Neighbors rode by often that season, not to laugh but to look. Jacob Miller came with a notebook one afternoon. He had rebuilt his barn with thicker rafters and extra bracing, but the memory of snow-crushing timber had not left him. "Show me the posts," he said. Caleb walked him through the barn slowly. He tapped each upright beam with his knuckles. He pointed to the spacing, the way the ceiling beams crossed in 2 directions so weight spread instead of pressing on one line. Jacob crouched and studied the base of a post. No rot. Not if I keep air moving and the floor dry. And the smell? Jacob asked, almost embarrassed to bring up his old joke. Caleb lifted a board from the aisle and showed the sand beneath. Liquid drains through. Solid gets hauled out daily. Air rises through the shafts. It is work, but it is cleaner than panic. Jacob nodded. Word traveled beyond their valley by midsummer. A rancher from east of Fort Lincoln rode 2 days to see the hillside barn for himself. He had lost mules in the storm and did not trust his rebuilt barn to face another like it. He stood at the entrance and frowned. You ever fear cave-in? Every day, Caleb answered honestly. That's why I build as if I expect one. The man walked inside, looked up at the thick beams and ran a hand along the packed earth ceiling. You've buried your risk. No, Caleb said, I've spread it. The man did not laugh, but not everyone admired the idea. In late summer, a hard rain fell for 2 straight days. The prairie turned slick and heavy. Water streamed down the hillside above Caleb's house. Though his trench carried most of it away, a thin line of damp appeared along one interior wall. Anna saw it first. Is it leaking? She asked, her voice tight. Caleb pressed his palm to the wall. The boards were cool but not soft. Still, the sight troubled him. That night he lay awake, listening not to wind this time but to rain tapping steady on the roof above. The thought pressed at him harder than any neighbor's mockery had. Had he trusted earth too much? At dawn he climbed the hill behind the house. He studied the slope with fresh eyes. Rainwater was not just falling, it was flowing, and it followed the easiest path. His trench handled surface water at the barn face. But the ground above the house had no guide. He worked 3 days cutting a shallow diversion channel across the slope uphill from the house. Not deep, just enough to turn heavy runoff sideways so it would move past rather than over the buried structure. When the next rain came, the damp line did not return. Caleb understood something then. The blizzard had proven strength against cold and wind, but water would be the long fight. In October of that year, old Ben Carney brought 2 young men with him to study the design. Ben had been hired to build a partial bank barn for a ranch near Painted Woods, not fully underground, just backed into a slope with earth packed against 3 walls. I told them about your storm, Ben said, but they need to see why it worked. Caleb did not speak in grand terms. He showed them the simple truths. 8 feet of soil does not change temperature fast, he said. It holds steady near 50. The horses give off heat. That heat stays because wind cannot strip it away. He tapped a beam overhead. And this, he added, is why snow cannot crush it. The load spreads across many posts. If one fails, others carry it. Never give weight one path to travel. The young men asked about the ventilation shafts. Caleb had lengthened them slightly after the blizzard, raising their caps higher above roofline to prevent drifting from sealing them too easily. Air must move, he said. Warm air rises, let it. Cool air replaces it. Do not trap damp. He did not use words like physics. He used what he had seen. That winter was milder, but fear lingered in the county like a shadow. Every cloud carried memory. When January came again, Jacob Miller rode out during the first hard freeze. I cut into my own hill, he admitted without greeting. Not as deep as yours, but half my barn sits in earth now. Caleb nodded once. Does it feel different? Yes, Jacob said, quieter. That was the word Caleb had never found, quieter. The prairie wind roared across open ground. It rattled boards and found every crack in standing walls, but inside the hill sound softened. It dulled to a distant rush instead of a violent roar. The horses sensed it too. They no longer hesitated at the ramp. When wind rose, they drifted toward the entrance themselves, preferring the stable earth to the open corral. In the third year after the great storm, a younger rancher named Eli Turner tried to copy the design without patience. He cut too steep into a sandy slope west of town. He spaced his posts too far apart, trying to save timber. The ceiling sagged that fall before winter even arrived. No animals died, but the scare traveled faster than any success story. Caleb rode out to see the damage. The soil there was loose and layered, not firm clay like his own hillside. You must build to the ground you have, Caleb told Eli, not to the ground you wish you had. Eli listened. That lesson spread as well. By 1890, 3 full underground barns and several half-bank structures stood within 10 miles of the Hartwell place. None identical, each shaped by slope, soil, and herd size. Caleb's own barn grew that year. He added 4 more stalls along the north wall, cutting deeper into the hill with careful bracing before removing earth. Expansion underground took longer than building outward. Every cut required thought. His sons, now grown taller than he was, handled axes and saws with steady skill. They understood the work not as novelty, but as method. One evening after supper, Anna stood at the kitchen table and pressed her hand flat against the floor. "It still feels warm," she said quietly. Caleb looked at her and allowed himself the smallest smile. "Because the horses are breathing," he replied. Years later, men from the Territorial Agricultural Office would visit and sketch the layout. They would use terms Caleb never had and draw clean lines where he had drawn chalk on earth. They would publish bulletins advising earth-sheltered structures for livestock in severe climates. But in that second spring, none of that was known. What was known was simpler. A hillside that once drew laughter now drew wagons carrying measuring rods and notebooks. And the man who had dug into the ground when others built toward the sky had learned something else as well. Survival is not one victory in one storm. It is watching the walls for damp in spring. It is clearing vents after drifting snow. It is digging channels for rain you have not yet seen. The blizzard had proven his idea. The seasons after proved his discipline. By the 4th winter after the great storm, the laughter had turned into questions. Men no longer rode out to see Caleb Hartwell's hillside barn as a curiosity. They came with tools in their saddlebags and worry in their eyes. The prairie had not forgotten how to kill, and no one in McLean County trusted a quiet autumn anymore. In early November, a sharp, cold front pushed down from Canada faster than anyone expected. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in a single day. Ponds skimmed over by dusk. Wind stiffened before supper. Caleb had just finished stacking hay in the underground loft when he felt the change. Air inside the barn shifted, not colder, just heavier. The kind of pressure that meant weather was turning hard. He climbed the ramp and stepped outside. The sky had a low, bruised color to the north. Inside the house, Anna was kneading bread dough. "Another one?" she asked without looking up. "Not like 87, Caleb said, but sharp." He went back down and checked each stall latch. He tested the vent shafts. He cleared a thin crust of frost from the outer intake pipes. The horses stamped, sensing the pressure shift. That night wind rose quick and mean. Not a blizzard, no deep snow, just bitter air and gusts that rattled every loose board across the valley. The next morning Jacob Miller rode up again. "Lost 2 calves," he said. "Cold caught them before we got them in." He stepped into the underground barn and stood still. The air inside was cool but steady, not sharp, not biting. "You ever worry about fire?" Jacob asked suddenly. The question surprised Caleb. "Why fire?" "Hay, wood, you've got both below your house. What if a lantern tips?" Caleb nodded slowly. It was a fair fear. "I do not bring open flame down here unless I must," he said. "Lanterns stay near the entrance. I keep the hay loft separate from the stall line, and I pack earth around the outer walls thick enough that if fire starts, it does not race." Jacob studied the beams again. "It's harder to burn what sits in soil," he said. "Harder," Caleb corrected, "not impossible." That word mattered to him. He had learned not to trust absolutes. Late that winter, something happened that tested not strength, but animal sense. A young stallion Caleb had bought the previous fall began to show temper. Horse was strong, fast, and not yet fully broken. One windy afternoon, when gusts howled across the prairie, the animal refused to descend the ramp. It planted its hooves and jerked against the lead rope. Caleb did not yank. He waited. The horse snorted, eyes wide at the dark opening. Wind whistled above them, rattling the corral fence. The open prairie offered noise and motion. The barn offered stillness and shadow. Caleb stepped halfway down the ramp himself and stood quiet. He did not pull. He did not shout. He let the stallion feel the difference in air, wind at the back, still earth ahead. After a long minute, the horse shifted its weight and stepped forward. Inside, the stallion calmed within moments. Caleb understood then that the barn did more than hold warmth. It muted chaos. Animals sensed that. So did men. In the spring of 1891, a delegation from a ranch 20 miles east arrived in a wagon. They had lost nearly half their herd in a flash storm the year before. Their land was flatter than Caleb's, but a low ridge ran along the north edge of their claim. "We don't have a hill like yours," one of them said. "Just a rise." Caleb rode out with them 2 days later. He studied their soil, kicked at the ground with his boot, dug a shallow test hole. The earth was firmer than it looked. "You can build half into it," he said. "Bank the north wall deep with soil, leave the south open. It won't be the same, but it will cut the wind." They listened. Back home, his eldest son, Matthew, had begun drawing small sketches of the barn layout in a notebook. Not detailed plans like an engineer might draft, just stall spacing, post grids, vent paths. "You plan to build one of your own?" Caleb asked one evening. Matthew nodded. "If I take land west of here, there's a ridge I could use." Caleb leaned back in his chair. "Then remember this," he said. "The hill is not the idea. The idea is to let earth carry what wind tries to steal." Matthew did not forget. That summer brought a different challenge: heat. The prairie baked under weeks of high sun. Surface barns grew stifling by afternoon. Flies thickened in the shade. Horses sweated even standing still. Inside the hillside barn, the temperature barely shifted. Caleb noticed it first when he walked down after tending fields at midday. The air inside felt like early morning, not late July. Cool. Not cold, just steady. Anna followed him once out of curiosity. "It's like stepping into a cellar," she said. "The ground holds last winter's cold longer than air does," Caleb replied, "and it holds winter's warmth when cold returns." He began to see that the design did not serve only winter survival. It reduced stress year-round. The horses ate more evenly. They rested better in summer heat. By 1893, more than half the ranchers within a day's ride had adopted some form of earth sheltering. Not all dug full barns under houses. Some banked walls with soil 3 or 4 feet deep. Some cut shallow storage rooms for feed beneath slopes. One man even built a root cellar for vegetables based on the same principle after watching how stable Caleb's barn remained. Not every attempt succeeded. A rancher south of the river ignored drainage advice and carved into a sandy embankment without bracing. After heavy rain, part of his wall slumped inward. No animals were inside at the time, but the lesson traveled quickly. Caleb rode out again to help shore up the structure. He did not scold. He set extra posts and packed stone behind the wall. "You must respect the soil you cut," he told the man. "Clay holds different than sand. Gravel drains different than loam. Earth gives strength only if you listen to it." By the mid-1890s, what had once been mockery had become quiet acceptance. No one called the hillside barn madness anymore. Then came the winter of 1896. It did not roar like the death storm of '87. It crept. Cold settled early and refused to lift. Snow came in layers, not all at once. Weeks passed where the sun rose pale and gave little heat. Surface barns held, but feed froze hard. Water troughs crusted thick each morning. Men woke before dawn to break ice and shovel drifts. Inside the Hartwell hillside barn, the temperature stayed just above freezing without effort. Caleb still tended his animals daily, still cleaned stalls, still checked beams. But he burned less wood than most families half his size. One night in January, Matthew came in from checking fence lines and stamped snow from his boots. "The Turner boys lost 3 horses this week," he said quietly. "Cold stress." Caleb nodded. He did not speak triumph. He thought, instead of the first Sunday after church when Jacob had laughed, of the hole in the hillside. Of the days when he doubted himself over damp walls and rain channels. He had not built the barn to prove neighbors wrong. He had built it because the wind on open prairie did not care about pride. When spring finally returned in 1897, losses across the county were lower than in past hard winters. Not because storms were weaker, but because more ranchers had adapted. The county agent visited that year and asked Caleb to explain his design for a small printed bulletin. Caleb agreed, though he spoke plainly. "Write that the ground is steady when air is not," he said. "Write that animals warm a space if wind cannot steal it, and write that drainage matters more than pride." The bulletin circulated through the territory. Years later, agricultural colleges would teach earth-sheltered livestock housing as sound practice in cold regions. They would measure soil temperature at 6 feet deep and find it hovered near 50 degrees year-round. They would calculate snow loads and beam spacing with formulas. Caleb had done it first with shovel, timber, and caution. By the time his sons took over more of the ranch work, the hillside barn was no longer strange. It was part of the land, as natural as the slope itself. What began as a hole that drew laughter had become quiet proof that sometimes the safest answer on the prairie was not to fight the wind head-on. It was to step aside and let the earth do what it had always done: hold steady. By 1900, the hillside no longer looked altered. Grass had grown thick over the packed earth above the barn. Wildflowers spread in summer. From a distance, no stranger would guess that beneath that slope stood 12 stalls, stacked hay, and the quiet breath of horses. Caleb Hartwell was older now. His beard had gone gray along the chin. His hands were still strong, but they moved slower when lifting beams or tightening hinges. Most heavy work fell to his sons. The barn, however, still answered to him. One September afternoon, Matthew approached with a concern. "The north retaining wall in the far corner shows a slight bow," he said. "Not much, but enough to notice." Caleb did not dismiss it. They climbed down together and carried a straight plank to test the line of the wall. The bow was small, barely half an inch inward across several feet. Most men would have ignored it. Caleb did not. "Pressure shifts over time," he said. "Soil settles, wood dries." He studied the wall carefully. The earth outside was firm clay, but years of freeze and thaw could push slowly against boards. "Better to add strength before it asks for it," he said. They spent the next week installing 2 additional vertical posts against that section. They dug shallow pockets for the bases and wedged them tight between floor and ceiling beam. The work was cramped and careful, sweat mixed with clay dust in the close air. When finished, the wall stood straight and solid again. "You think it would have failed?" Matthew asked. "Maybe not this year," Caleb replied. "But I prefer never to find out." Maintenance, he had learned, was quieter than storms but just as important. In 1902, a young surveyor from the state capital visited the region. He had heard stories of underground barns and wanted to document one for a report on cold climate building methods. He arrived with measuring tape, pencil, and questions. Why not build fully below ground? The surveyor asked as they stood inside the stable. "Light," Caleb answered. "Horses need to see, and I need air to move freely. Full underground works in some soils. Here, a south opening gives sun in winter." The surveyor sketched the post grid and counted beam spacing. He measured vent shaft diameter and traced their path through the house roof. "You calculated load?" he asked. "I guessed high," Caleb said, "then built higher." The surveyor smiled. "Your spacing is within range of what engineers would recommend." Caleb shrugged. Engineers and storms both punish weak beams. That winter brought something new. Not a blizzard, not crushing snow, but weeks of relentless wind without snowfall. Dry, cutting wind that stripped moisture from everything it touched. Surface barns creaked constantly under the strain. Doors warped. Gaps widened. Haystacks dried too fast and turned brittle. Inside the hillside barn, the air stayed steadier. Wind did not race across the stalls. The horses remained calm while outside fences rattled like loose teeth. One evening, as wind scraped across the prairie again, Anna stood in the kitchen and listened. "It sounds far away," she said, because it was. Earth absorbed what open air amplified. By then, nearly every rancher within 15 miles had altered at least part of their structures to use soil as shield. Some had full bank barns cut halfway into slopes. Others had buried feed storage rooms to protect grain from heat and cold. Caleb noticed something else as the years passed. Fewer men boasted about how strong their barns were. More spoke quietly about drainage. In 1905, a new family settled near the river. They built a tall, handsome barn with bright red boards hauled from the east. It stood proud against the skyline, visible from miles away. Matthew rode out to welcome them. He returned uneasy. "They've built it high and open," he said. "No windbreak, no bank." Caleb did not criticize aloud. Every man learned in his own season. That December, a heavy wet snow fell, followed by sudden freeze. The weight clung to rafters. By morning, one side of the new barn roof sagged. No full collapse came, but enough damage that repairs lasted weeks. The new rancher rode to the Hartwell place in early spring. "I built for show," he admitted quietly. "Not for wind." Caleb walked him through the hillside barn once more. He did not say, "I told you so." He simply pointed to the posts and the thick earth above. "You cannot outbuild the prairie," Caleb said, "but you can hide from it." In 1908, Matthew purchased his own tract of land west of the original homestead. A low ridge ran along its north boundary, just as he had once described years before. He cut into that ridge the following summer, not identical to his father's design. He adjusted stall width, used slightly thicker beams, and widened the south opening for more light. But the principle held. When Caleb visited, he stood inside his son's barn and felt the familiar hush. "You improved the ventilation," he said, noticing the slightly larger intake shafts. "I learned from clearing yours in snow," Matthew replied. That pleased him more than praise ever had. Time moved. Seasons layered themselves across the prairie as steadily as the packed soil above the stable ceiling. In 1910, a severe rainstorm hit late in autumn when ground was already hard with frost. Surface runoff had nowhere to sink and instead raced downhill. Several surface barns flooded ankle-deep before men could dig trenches. Caleb's diversion channel above the house carried water sideways as it had for years. The trench at the barn face guided what remained into the sump pit. Inside, the floor stayed dry. That storm confirmed something many had begun to accept. The hillside barn did not solve one problem. It solved many small ones at once: cold, wind, heat, snow load, even noise. In 1915, Caleb fell ill for the first time in decades. A winter fever left him weak for weeks. Matthew and his younger brother Samuel managed the ranch during that season. From his bed above the barn ceiling, Caleb listened to the faint sounds rising through the floor: hooves shifting, hay rustling, slow breaths in the dark. He realized then that the barn had outgrown him. It no longer needed his hands every day. It had become system instead of experiment. When he finally recovered enough strength to climb down the ramp once more, he rested his palm against a central support post. The wood felt solid beneath his skin. "Still holding," he murmured. Samuel smiled. "Like it always has." By the time Caleb passed in 1918, the hillside barn had stood more than 30 years. It had endured blizzards, drought, heavy rain, wind without snow, snow without wind, and seasons that seemed gentle but tested patience instead of strength. The entrance remained modest. No painted boards, no high loft doors facing the horizon, just a slope in the earth and a wide opening that caught southern sun. Matthew and Samuel continued to use it. They expanded once more, carving a smaller chamber off the west side for equipment storage. They reinforced posts where age demanded it. They replaced boards when wear showed. The barn never made headlines. It simply kept horses alive. Decades later, as tractors replaced teams and new metal buildings rose across North Dakota, some filled in their old hillside stables and built modern sheds above ground. But many kept at least part of their barns banked in soil. Agricultural schools by then taught earth-sheltered livestock housing as sound practice in severe climates. They spoke of thermal mass and passive ventilation. They ran experiments to confirm what one rancher had learned with shovel and instinct. The lesson remained simple. Build to the land you stand on. Respect water before wind. Spread weight. Never trust one beam to carry what many can share. The prairie had not grown gentler over time, but those who listened to it had grown wiser. And beneath a quiet slope south of the Missouri River, timber and earth still prove that sometimes the strongest shelter is the one the wind cannot see. By the early 1920s, the prairie looked different. Barbed wire stretched farther. Rail lines cut straighter paths across open ground. New barns rose with milled lumber hauled in by train. Some were taller than any structure Caleb Hartwell had ever built. Matthew Hartwell stood on the ridge above his father's old hillside barn and watched progress roll in on steel wheels. He did not resent it. But he did not forget the winter stories either. The underground stable still held 12 horses. The beams were darker now with age. The earth above had compacted tighter with decades of rain and frost. What had once been experiment had become inheritance. In 1923, a brutal cold front arrived without warning late in November. Not a blizzard, no great snow, just a plunge in temperature so sudden that unprotected water lines burst across the county. Frost split boards. Surface troughs froze solid before sunrise. A neighbor named Harold Keene had built a tall, modern barn with wide windows and a high gambrel roof. It was handsome and bright, but it stood open to north wind. When the cold hit, he burned through his woodpile in 4 days trying to keep interior temperatures from dropping below zero. The wind slid through small cracks and stripped heat faster than fire could replace it. Matthew rode over to check on him. Inside the tall barn, breath hung in clouds. 2 horses shivered despite heavy blankets. "Feels like the outside is inside," Harold muttered. Matthew did not argue. He simply said, "Come see something." They rode back to the Hartwell place and descended the ramp. Inside, the air sat steady near freezing but not below, not biting, not cruel. The horses shifted calmly in their stalls. "No stove?" Harold asked. "Just what they bring with them," Matthew answered. Harold stood silent for a long time. "I thought taller meant better," he said at last. "More air, more light." "Taller means more surface for wind," Matthew replied gently. "Light helps, but only if the walls can hold it." Harold returned home and began banking soil along his north wall before winter fully settled in. Progress did not erase memory. It tested it. In 1926, A summer drought struck hard. Pastures browned early. Wells sank lower than men liked to admit. Heat lay over the prairie like a blanket no one could throw off. Surface barns became ovens by mid-afternoon. Horses were turned out early and brought in only at night to escape heat. Inside the hillside barn, temperature rose some, but far less than outside. Samuel, now gray at the temples, stood in the central aisle and felt the difference. "The ground remembers winter," he said quietly. The stable served not only against cold, but against heat. In 1930, a traveling agricultural agent visited the region to document traditional practices that had proven durable over decades. He had read earlier reports mentioning earth-sheltered barns and wanted first-hand evidence that they still functioned as described. He measured interior temperatures over several days, comparing them to surface readings. He noted humidity levels and air movement near the vent shafts. He inspected post bases for rot. "What surprises me," he admitted, closing his notebook, "is how little change you've had to make in 40 years. Matthew smiled faintly. "We changed small things early," he said. "Drainage, vent caps, extra bracing. After that we watched." The agent asked why more ranchers did not build fully underground if results were so steady. Matthew answered as his father once had, "Because land is not the same everywhere. Some slopes are sand, some flood, some are too shallow. You must build to what you stand on." That principle mattered more than any single design. The 1930s brought dust storms to parts of the plains. While McLean County did not suffer as harshly as regions farther south, dry years still tested soil stability. One spring, after weeks without rain, fine dust blew across open fields and drifted against buildings. Surface barns required constant sweeping to keep dust from coating feed. Inside the hillside barn, air remained clearer. The south entrance let in light but little blowing grit. The vent shafts drew air from controlled points rather than wide cracks. Samuel noticed the difference as he brushed down a horse one afternoon. "Less grit in their coats," he said. Matthew nodded. "The hill shields more than snow." As decades passed, tractors began replacing teams. Fewer horses filled the stalls, but the underground space adapted again. Equipment storage took over some stalls. Grain bins occupied others. The stable never stood empty. In 1942, during wartime shortages, fuel became precious. Wood and coal were rationed. Many families cut back on heating wherever they could. The Hartwell house still drew gentle warmth upward from the stable below. Even with fewer animals, the Earth's steady temperature reduced fuel needs. What had once been a survival measure against blizzards now served quietly against scarcity. A younger generation sometimes asked why they did not fill in the old barn and build something new. Samuel would answer simply, "Because it still works." In 1948, a young engineer from the state university visited to compare old earth-sheltered structures with modern insulated barns. He brought instruments and spoke in technical language about thermal gradients and structural redundancy. After a full day of measurement, he stood outside the south-facing entrance and looked up at the slope. "You built this without formal calculation," he said. "My father did," Matthew replied. "And his spacing and load distribution are close to what we would recommend today." Matthew looked at the hillside, at grass swaying gently above the buried beams. "He built for storms," he said, "not for praise." The engineer smiled. "Storms are better teachers than professors," he said. By the early 1950s, most ranches in the region used some combination of modern materials and old principles. Metal roofs replaced wooden shingles. Concrete footings reinforced walls. But earth was still banked against north sides. Hills were still cut carefully where slopes allowed. The Hartwell hillside barn had become less unusual and more foundational. When the property finally changed hands in 1954, the new owner chose to build a larger, modern livestock facility closer to the road. Trucks needed easier access. Machinery required wider doors. He did not destroy the old barn. He filled the south entrance gradually and leveled part of the ramp, sealing the underground chamber from daily use. But he left the structure intact beneath the slope. Too solid to tear out, he admitted. Timber posts still stood in darkness. Beams still carried weight. The earth above remained firm. Years later, local historians would dig into county records and find early notes about a rancher who built beneath his house when others built toward the sky. They would marvel that the design endured so long with so little failure. But the men who lived through blizzards did not marvel. They remembered cold that burned lungs and wind that flattened fences. They remembered the sound of roofs cracking. And they remembered stepping into a hillside and hearing only the steady sound of horses breathing. The underground barn had begun as a strange answer to a deadly question. It endured because it answered more than one season. It answered fear. It answered waste. It answered pride with patience. And though newer buildings stood brighter in the sun, none could claim what the hill once proved in silence. When wind howled across the prairie, the earth did not move. And the barn that chose to hide within it did not either. By the late 1960s, few people in the county remembered the first winter the hillside barn had saved the Hartwell horses. New highways cut through prairie grass. Grain elevators rose taller than any barn. Diesel engines replaced teams almost entirely. Young ranchers talked about horsepower in engines, not in stalls. But under a quiet slope south of the Missouri River, the underground structure still rested in darkness. The south entrance had long been filled in, the ramp erased by time and grading. From the outside, nothing marked the place except a slight dip in the contour of the land. Grass grew thick where hooves once stepped. Inside, the posts remained upright. In 1974, a heavy spring flood hit the region after deep winter snow melted fast. Creeks swelled beyond their banks. Surface barns near low ground took on water for days. Mud ruined feed. Wooden supports soaked and warped. The old Hartwell hillside sat high enough to avoid floodwater, but runoff from above tested the drainage channels cut decades earlier. Water traced the diversion trench Caleb had once carved by hand. It flowed sideways and past the buried chamber, exactly as intended. The barn itself stayed dry. No one used it then for livestock, but its survival through another test reinforced what older ranchers already knew. Good design does not expire. In 1982, a local history teacher named Laura Bennett began researching frontier construction methods for a regional museum exhibit. She found brief mentions in early agricultural bulletins about earth-sheltered barns built after the blizzard of 1887. One name appeared repeatedly in old county records: Caleb Hartwell. Laura traced property maps and discovered that the original homestead still existed, though owned by a different family. She requested permission to examine the hillside. With careful excavation at the old south face, she uncovered the sealed entrance. The timber door frame still stood beneath layers of packed soil. Inside, dust hung thick, but the beams remained solid. She walked through the underground space with a flashlight. The posts formed a tight forest of vertical strength. Ceiling beams crossed overhead in a grid. The vent shafts, though rusted at their caps, still reached upward through the slope. Laura later wrote in her notes that the structure showed little deviation from modern load distribution principles. She estimated that the beam spacing differed by less than 10% from what engineers now calculated for similar snow loads. She did not call it primitive. She called it practical. Her research brought renewed attention to the forgotten barn. A small article appeared in the local paper describing how one rancher had used earth insulation and structural redundancy to protect livestock when others relied solely on exposed lumber. Older residents nodded when they read it. They had heard the stories from their fathers and grandfathers. In the 1990s, agricultural colleges across northern states began studying energy-efficient livestock housing more seriously. Rising fuel costs made passive temperature control attractive again. Researchers promoted bermed walls and partially banked barns to reduce heating needs. Few realized that such ideas had once been tested not in laboratories, but in storms. A professor visiting the county in 1998 requested access to the old Hartwell structure for documentation. He brought students with measuring tools and digital thermometers. They recorded soil temperature at depth near the old ceiling level. Even after decades of abandonment, readings hovered near 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Stable, predictable, just as Caleb had once claimed. The professor explained to his students that soil at sufficient depth changes temperature slowly because it holds heat from past seasons. That thermal mass resists rapid shifts caused by air temperature swings. He pointed to the close post spacing and described how distributing load reduces the chance of catastrophic collapse. Then he paused. "Someone understood this long before we formalized it," he said. The students ran hands over timber cut by hand tools nearly a century earlier. The barn was not a relic of ignorance. It was evidence of adaptation. In 2009, the County Historical Society cataloged a box of old documents donated by a Hartwell descendant. Inside were hand-drawn sketches of the original hillside design. Rough lines showed post grids and vent placement. Notes described drainage slopes and beam thickness. The sketches were not elegant, but they were careful. A structural engineer who reviewed them later remarked that the estimated load capacity exceeded likely snow loads by a comfortable margin. "He built margin into every decision," the engineer wrote. Margin had been the difference between laughter and loss. Today, the original underground chamber remains sealed but intact. The land above is pasture once more. Modern metal barns stand elsewhere on the property, bright and functional. Yet when storms sweep across North Dakota and wind presses hard against exposed walls, some ranchers still bank soil against north faces. Some still design stalls partially below grade. Some still remember that air can steal heat faster than earth can. The lesson did not vanish with timber. It changed form. The story of the hillside barn is not about one clever man proving neighbors wrong. It is about a pattern repeated across generations. Look at the land, study the wind, respect water, spread weight, allow animals to help warm the space they live in, and never assume that taller means stronger. Modern engineers speak of resilience and redundancy. They model snow load and thermal transfer with precise numbers. They design livestock housing with insulation ratings and airflow charts. All of that matters, but at its heart, the principle remains the same one Caleb Hartwell trusted with shovel in hand. The prairie will test whatever you build. If you fight it with pride, it will win. If you work with its rules, it may let you endure. The underground barn beneath his house did not stop storms from coming. It simply refused to stand where storms could break it. That is why it lasted. That is why others copied it. And that is why, more than a century later, when wind rolls across open ground and snow begins to drift, some ranchers still glance toward a hillside and consider what might lie beneath it. Because sometimes the strongest shelter is not the one that towers into the sky. It is the one that trusts the earth to hold steady when everything above it trembles.